Welcome to Tea Book Club, a discussion on Patricia Highsmith's The Talented Mr. Ripley. This event is presented by the House of Chanel.
If Gabrielle Chanel's life were a playlist, it would start with the hymns of her childhood and jump to the cabaret that gave her the nickname Coco. Next up, a bel canto aria played on her own grand piano, and of course, the Beatles live in London with jazz and blues and Johnny Halliday and Stravinsky in between. The playlist would close with a song from Coco, the Broadway musical that starred Katharine Hepburn in the title role. Watch the film that explores this eclectic, refined musical journey on InsideChanel.com.
Hello, I'm Hanya Yanagihara, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Tea Magazine. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the fourth installation of the Tea Book Club, where we're reading works of classic American literature. Tonight, we'll be discussing Patricia Highsmith's 1955 The Talented Mr. Ripley, the much-adapted, irresistible novel about Tom Ripley, one of literature's most mesmerizing grifters. Explaining Highsmith and her most famous character is the renowned writer Edmund White. I hope you enjoy this presentation, and please visit tmagazine.com for more information about Highsmith's life and to sign up for future sessions of the Tea Book Club.
Good evening, and welcome to the fourth installment of the Tea Book Club. I'm Thessaly LaForce, Tea's Features Director. Tonight, we'll be exploring Patricia Highsmith's 1955 psychological thriller, The Talented Mr. Ripley, with Edmund White. A novelist, memoirist, and essayist, Edmund is the author of over 30 books, including The Beautiful Room is Empty and City Boy, as well as the forthcoming novel, A Previous Life, which will be published in November. If the first line of his essay about the talented Mr. Ripley for Tea, quote, Patricia Highsmith is Tom Ripley without the charm, is any indication, we are in for quite a treat. Afterwards, I'll join Edmund for a conversation and to answer questions that you've submitted. Tea Magazine will be in the chat to answer any additional questions. And now, I'm honored to introduce Edmund White.
Patricia Highsmith was a great writer and a terrible person. Being monstrous is something we admire in performers. We want our actresses to be bitchy and our singers to be rude and temperamental divas, preferably suicidal. But writers and composers are supposed to be wise and even-tempered. We're shocked when a new biography reveals our favorite poet was a bad family man. Highsmith, a lesbian Donna Juana who claimed she had had sex with 10 different women in one day, was born in Texas in 1921 and died in Switzerland in 1995. She disliked most people, an equal opportunity hater, as one of her friends called her. Hitchcock made a movie of her early novel, Strangers on a Train, and The Talented Mr. Ripley was made into movies 3 times, most recently in 1999, starring Jude Law, Matt Damon, and Gwyneth Paltrow. Her lesbian novel, The Price of Salt, was made into Carol with Kate Blanchett. There are a million things to say about Tom Ripley, but I would like to concentrate on only 2, his fuzzy sense of gender and of reality. He constantly remembers the taunt of his aunt who raised him, that he is a sissy, just like his father. When he comes to New York, he falls in with a sexually ambiguous crowd in which several of the men make a pass at him, always rebuffed. It's not a crowd that he really likes or respects. He wants to lose them. The millionaire father of an acquaintance of his, Dickie Greenleaf, finances Tom's trip to a southern Italian village where he's supposed to lure Dickie into returning to America. Dickie's mother is dying in New York. But Dickie can't be lured. He has a young woman friend in the village, Marge, who is in love with him. The love is unreciprocated. She becomes jealous and possessive when Tom becomes a close friend to Dickie and accuses Tom of being homosexual. Tom entertains Dickie with his impersonations of older women, especially Eleanor Roosevelt. When Dickie cools on Tom, Tom kills him and assumes Dickie's identity. It helps that they look alike and wear the same sizes. This is where the blurred reality takes over. Tom feels much, much better about himself playing Dickie than he ever did being Tom Ripley. When he is alone in Paris at Christmas, he feels alone, but so much a part of things. He was Dickie, good-natured, naive Dickie, with a smile for everyone and 1,000 francs for anyone who asked him. At a Paris party, he knows no one, but he feels completely at ease. He's no longer a penniless little sissy, but a rich, handsome American aristocrat. He wears Dickie's rings, writes letters that pretend to be from Dickie on Dickie's Hermes typewriter, brushes his teeth with his elbow sticking out as Dickie did, eats his morning eggs as Dickie did, scooping the egg out of the shell, dances in his clumsy manner, speaks with his intonations. He is so good at impersonating Dickie, even when he is alone, that he must practice to be Tom. Quote, "It was a good idea to practice jumping into his own character again, because the time might come when he would need, in a matter of seconds, to become himself, and it was strangely easy to forget the exact timbre of Tom Ripley's voice." Later, he thinks, it was impossible ever to be lonely or bored, he thought, so long as he was Dickie Greenleaf. After all, Highsmith's model for the book was Henry James' The Ambassadors, in which the emissary sent to Paris to bring the wayward young man home switches places with him. The themes of sexual and identity confusion come together when Tom has to kill Freddie Miles, who suspects that Tom and Dickie are lovers. Dickie, he doesn't know, is already dead. After he kills Freddie, he thinks how sad and pointless his death was. Of course one could loathe Freddie too, he thought, a selfish, stupid bastard who had sneered at one of his best friends. Dickie certainly was one of his best friends, just because he suspected him of sexual deviation. Where was the sex? Where was the deviation? He looked at Freddie and said low and bitterly, "Freddie Miles, you're a victim of your own dirty mind." It's true that Tom has killed Dickie, but he still thinks of him as his best friend and feels obliged to protect his reputation. At one point, he regrets that he killed Dickie. He could have lived the rest of his life with Dickie, he thinks, if only he'd played his cards right. Patricia Highsmith was similarly confused sexually and existentially. Over the years in interviews, she would talk of Ripley as a real person, a friend, someone she admired. In her diaries, she writes of female lovers who didn't really exist except in her imagination. She invented an entire affair with a phantom called Chloe. She hated being thought of as an intellectual. She wanted to be an instinctive artist, always daydreaming. She would get her best ideas for her books while traveling, ironing, sewing, or sitting in the dentist chair. She thought often of murdering people, especially those she loved, and she would write about that in her notebooks. She would act out scenes from her books, or before she wrote them, actually. She would prowl through her darkened house with a flashlight in order to know what it was like to be a prowler. Her favorite pets were cats and snails. She especially admired snails' passionless way of mating. She once declared she was a man who loved women, and she would talk about her erections. Her favorite activity was writing. She couldn't wait for dinner guests to leave so she could get back to the book she was working on. Strangely enough, though she was extremely difficult, she had many friends. I met her once in Tangier, where Paul Bowles introduced me to her. She was charming. I found myself drawn to her instantly.
That was a lovely talk, Edmund. I can't believe you met Patricia Highsmith. That's incredible. My first question for you is, why do you think Tom Ripley became such a beloved character for readers? And why do you think Patricia Highsmith found him so compelling herself?
Well, I think in my little article I wrote for T Magazine, I advanced the idea that maybe gay people like myself, or I'm about the same age as a little younger than Patricia Highsmith would be, but still people who grew up gay in the 50s, they spent a lot of time uh, pretending they were somebody else. I mean, because you weren't allowed to be gay. So if you wanted to talk to your office mate about your new boyfriend, you had to make it into a girl. And more importantly, you had to remember all the details that you had proposed. I mean, Proust went through that because and Highsmith certainly did, and certainly Tom Ripley does, because he is inventing a whole past um, um, for Dickie's father, and he makes up constantly lies that he has to remember and be consistent with. I think that's something like being a novelist. And the other thing, why did he become so popular? I think because people identify with somebody who is struggling against the system. You know, I think that a lot of 19th century novelistic heroes are people who are struggling against the odds, and in a way, we, even though Tom Ripley is so amoral, and we like it that he started off as at the bottom of the ladder, and that he's ending up rich and unpunished, and has kind of fooled everybody. I mean, he's a kind of Till Eulenspiegel figure, if you like.
Yeah, I've always found myself rooting for him, even when he's in the middle of murdering someone. I wanted to also know, a lot of people label Tom Ripley various sort of, he's been called a con man, a scammer, a psychopath. What do you think of those types of labels? Do you think they're accurate?
Well, I think the reality is always more interesting than the label. And I mean, the labels are kind of thought stoppers that make you, oh, yes, he's this and that. But I think he's certainly not a psychopath, because a psychopath is somebody like Trump who can't imagine what it would be like, has no empathy. Whereas I think Tom has a lot of empathy for other people, and he can see things from their point of view.
Let's talk about her writing style a little bit. You're a writer as well, and I'm just so curious to hear your perspective on how you think she successfully builds, tension or creates suspense throughout the novel.
Well, I think suspense is generated when the reader knows what's going to happen, that is, somebody will be murdered, but they're just waiting to see how and when it will take place. Whereas mystery is generated when the reader is as much in the dark as all the characters are, and the private eye. I mean, they all have to discover what happened together. But so I think she was really a suspense writer, and I think she liked to think that she was a literary writer or that she brought literary values to genre writing, because I mean I think in her day, except for Edgar Allan Poe and somebody, like there was some other, like the one who wrote The Thin Man. They were considered literary writers, but most people who publish thrillers were looked down on by the literary establishment, and she wanted very much to be considered a literary writer, and uh, and I think she is because her writing almost never indulges in cliches. Her her descriptions are accurate, but not long-winded. Her dialogue is very pointed and advances the action. It's never illustrative, where you say, like, she was very angry. I'm mad at you, she said. That kind of illustrative dialogue she never writes. I mean, she always uh, has people oftentimes saying the contrary of what they're feeling, and 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 the plots are very tightly woven. I mean, we're constantly on edge because we think maybe Tom will be discovered, though he's quite reckless himself. He says several times that it's the game that he enjoys and the risk, and he doesn't want everything to be settled in advance.
That's so true. And I as a reader enjoyed when he would take, I mean, I would be on the edge of my seat, but I enjoyed the risks he was taking too.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for someone who is writing or wants to write a thriller?
I mean, I am writing. I had a murder in my last book, and I'll have a murder in a new book that I'm writing. So this is kind of new for me. I've never done it before, but I think one of the ways to make it literary and not genre is to psychologize it in a very deep way. I mean, to see, I mean, the the murderer shouldn't be somebody for whom this is just paid work the way it might be for a mafia member. It should be somebody who's kind of astonished that he's doing this horrible thing, and but does it anyway. I mean, I think that probably killing somebody, as Highsmith herself thought, is very much like making love to them. That is, you really don't know what you're doing, and I mean, and people who do know what they're doing are kind of hateful. I mean, if you know how to make love in a very in a very polished way, it makes you sort of a bounder. Whereas if you are feeling everything intensely and inventing it as you go along, that makes it feel much more real. And I think it must be the same with murder.
Sort of towards the end of The Talented Mr. Ripley, the police are investigating where Dickie's disappeared, and Tom says to the detective, Dickie was a very ordinary young man who liked to believe himself extraordinary, or extraordinary. Do you think that's accurate?
I do. I mean, I think that Dickie is kind of banal. I mean, he wants to be an artist, but we're led to think that he's a very bad artist, and and Tom, who doesn't know that much about art but seems to be quite intelligent, thinks his paintings are terrible daubs, and 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 later in the next Ripley book, um, Tom becomes a collector of paintings and a critic of painting. So he seems to know by instinct quite a bit about painting, and he thinks that Dickie is not very good. But Dickie's very self-important and takes himself very seriously.
Yes, it's true. Yeah, the the cringe that Tom feels when he looks at the paintings really got to me too.
Yep.
In her diary in 1970, Highsmith wrote, quote, "I learned to live with a grievous and murderous hatred very early on, and I learned to stifle also my more positive emotions." Was this, do you think, specific to Highsmith? Do you think all writers and artists in some way have to learn to live with their uglier emotions?
Well, I think they have to recognize what those emotions are if they're going to portray them. But I think that many writers were nice guys. Like Chekhov was supposed to have been a wonderful person. Everybody liked him. And I think, you know, writers are like probably butchers. There are nice ones and there are bad ones. I mean, it's a profession like any other. I don't think that but I do think you have to be in touch with your negative feelings if you're going to portray them. I mean, you have to be able to study them. And maybe, as in Highsmith's case, you live them out in your writing, but you don't actually murder people.
Right. I want to touch on sort of your own biography. In your essay for T Magazine, you write of going to see a psychiatrist, when you were much younger, who, quote unquote, argued that same-sex love was not inborn. It was only, he said, a symptom of a deeper neurosis caused, for instance, by an absent father or a stifling mother or by an Oedipus complex gone awry or something. Can you tell us a little bit more about that time in your life when you were going to a shrink and in the closet and everything?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the 1950s and well into the 60s. If you think Stonewall, the beginning of American gay liberation, didn't begin until 1968. So it means that people were really living all along with this feeling that gay people were living with the feeling that they were neurotic. And there was always a point in an evening, no matter how much fun it was and how we're all laughing and dancing and carrying on, we would all look around and say, "Oh God, we're sick." I mean, because we thought we were sick. And that, and my goal in therapy was to go straight. And I was engaged twice, and I'm still very close to one of the women I was engaged to. And I mean, I talked to her yesterday. I talked to her all the time. And, so I think that, but it was a very difficult period. And I think for many gay people, it took up almost all their energy to be gay. I mean, like gay people in the 50s seldom had brilliant careers. I mean, because they wanted to be a waiter at a diner and so they could peroxide their hair and run around and scream and be gay. And that was a full-time job, being gay, because people hated you so much. I remember when I was like 15 and the first time I was hanging out in downtown Chicago with gay people, and there was a straight couple sitting nearby who were looking with total contempt at us. And suddenly I realized, oh gosh, they see me that way too. A nice little Evanston boy. But I mean, here I am with all these freaks, and I'm a freak too.
Wait, can we also learn more about your time meeting Patricia Highsmith? It was a lunch, you say?
No, it was just very brief. I was interviewing Paul Bowles, whom I'd met several times, and he lived in Tangier, in probably the ugliest modern building in Tangier. And his wife, Jane, who by that point was dead, had an apartment downstairs from him. And Patricia Highsmith was staying there with Buffy. And they came up, and Patricia Highsmith surprised me. She seemed to know who I was. I think she was quite plugged in. She didn't like the literary scene, but I think she knew who everybody was. And we just met and shook hands. But she was affable and a little bit shy. and very nice. I mean, probably a monster otherwise. We know that she was a monster, but not to meet.
Right, right. And how do you think Patricia Highsmith would fare as a writer in our world today, right now? I keep thinking about how well she was able to channel repression and coding into her work, how narratively everything is operating on several levels. And Ripley, as you point out in your essay and your talk, is an imposter, but much in the way a closeted woman would be in the 1950s would be an imposter.
There are so many weird rules now, and I'm sure Highsmith would not have been able to pass them.
Yeah.
She would have gotten an F on a sensitivity test.
Yeah. Well, I think I do feel that, in this climate of sensitivity, people are afraid to be shocking or offensive. And I think she didn't mind being either.
Right. She's very, very bold. But, so is the Bible.
Right. Right.
So is Dickens. I mean, those are all bold writers, bold books.
I guess with her, I was thinking more about how her closet, she's not in the closet, but how, now in this era of identity and sort of being loud and proud of who you are, which she wasn't necessarily.
No, she would have had the same problems that Susan Sontag had. I mean, Sontag would tell anybody that she was a lesbian, and she had slept with many, many women and men, but many women. But she didn't want to be considered a lesbian writer or a female writer, or certainly not a feminist writer. She hated all those labels. She thought she should be a gold star, blue ribbon writer, period. And I'm sure Patricia Highsmith was the same way and would have hated identity politics.
Yeah. And the Benjamin Mosher biography of Sontag, I like that chapter where he compares Sontag to Adrienne Rich, because Adrienne Rich did identify as a lesbian writer, and Mosher kind of argues her career suffered in a way.
Yeah, starting with Diving into the Wreck, her book of poems, Diving into the Wreck, where she I know she was a friend of mine, and we lived through all that together. But I mean, I of course am considered a gay writer, but except in Europe, where, especially in Italy and France and Germany, I'm considered more a writer rather than a gay writer. But that's because identity politics certainly don't exist in France, and to a much lesser degree in Italy and Germany. England is like us.
Do you have a preference which one you would rather be, a gay writer or a writer?
Well, I don't mind being a gay writer because I think that you have to have a gimmick to be known at all in our very competitive culture. And I was lucky enough to, write the first gay sex book, the first gay coming out book, the first gay travel book. I wrote the first of each one of those genres, and it made my very tiny career. I mean, my career is tiny, but at least it exists.
I mean, I think many people would disagree with that, but anyway, we can move on to reader questions. Corin asks, are there any fictional anti-heroes from the last decade who could go toe-to-toe with Tom Ripley?
Well, I think this goes back a little bit more than a decade, but in Martin Amos's book, Money, the hero, John Self, is a total beast, and but a very unrepentant one who eats junk food and takes lots of drugs and stays in sordid hotels in Times Square and has sex with prostitutes endlessly. I mean, he's a very vivid, hateful character. I mean, I in my little essay for T Magazine, I mentioned Humbert, who is somebody that we all deplore, but not when we're reading the Lolita. When we're reading it, we're sort of cheering him on. But then when we finish it, we're horrified to discover that we've sympathized with the pedophile.
Yeah, totally. Mare writes in, do we have any idea if Highsmith thought or cared about the morality of Ripley's choices? He seems to be without moral values, and Highsmith might have been too. Does it matter? When we enjoy the books and the character, are we implicated? Highsmith is a guilty pleasure.
I think that's very intelligent, and I think it's true, and I think we should have guilty pleasures. I mean, everybody draws the line differently for themselves. I mean, like, I cannot read Celine because he was such a terrible anti-Semite, and I mean, he's funny. He's a great writer. He he writes wonderful books, but I cannot read them because of his terrible politics. And I mean, he really was active in his anti-Semitic hatred and hated gay people. He was a bad egg. But I think other writers like Ezra Pound, who was a fascist and who sympathized with Mussolini and gave speeches on Mussolini's behalf, is my favorite poet. So, I don't know. I think each person has to decide for themselves these very delicate questions of whether somebody's morality. I think definitely Ripley is amoral, and I think Highsmith wasn't much better. And I mean that she liked to imagine her friends suffering, and if she would go on a happy love trip with a girlfriend, she would be very resentful at the end of it because she fed off of agony and dispute, and that's what inspired her. And being happy was not her thing.
Poor woman. Well, this leads us to a question from Patricia. Please address Highsmith's reputation as a racist and, as you also point out, an anti-Semite. Was she really racist or simply reflecting the climate of her times?
No, I think she was extreme even for the period. I mean, it's very hard for us now, and people your age, to understand the nuances of all this in the 40s and 50s. But like my father, who was a horrible racist, he was a Texan and a cowboy, and anti-Semitic and certainly anti-black. Nevertheless, we had neighbors who were worse than him and completely cracked and who would go on and on about this. And my father would say, "Oh, I don't like that. Those people are crazy." I mean, so everybody cut the pie in slightly different ways in those days. And but I think that we're living in a really nice period where you can't be against women or against blacks or against Jews. I mean, for instance, I remember reading a novel written by Leon Adel, the Columbia scholar, a novel that he wrote in the 50s. And it's almost unreadable because it's so full of condescending remarks about women. But that was just common in that period.
Stephen asks, how much do you think the repression of homosexuality lent to Miss Highsmith's attitude in her fictional writing and or to her devilish ways in reality?
Well, I mean, I think, until gay liberation, she didn't really write directly about homosexuals, except in Carol, in the book that the movie Carol was based on, The Price of Salt. But that she published under a pseudonym. And her agent said, if you publish this under your own name, it'll destroy your career. But when she would cruise the lesbian bars, she would let it be known that she was the woman who'd written those books, that book. And then after gay liberation, she wrote The Trimmer of Forgery, about a man who is struggling with his sexual identity. He's engaged to a woman, but he's very attracted to the boys in Tunisia where he is living. And that kind of ambivalence. Well, and there's a lot of people see Tom Ripley as just openly gay, but I don't think so. I mean, in the second book, he gets married to a woman, but it's a rather cool, strange, alienated marriage, but still he's married. And I don't know. I think he's almost too much of a interested in survival to dally with sexuality. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in the movie the one with Jude Law and Matt Damon, they give him a lover, right? They give him a gay love affair in the movie. They sort of put it more out.
Oh yeah, he murders that boy
Right.
in the boat. Yeah,
Yeah.
that boy who gets murdered was the son of a very good friend of mine, Mariah Aiken, who is an actress and a director of plays.
Oh.
But you know, and that boy is totally straight, but I think he did a good job of playing a gay person.
Oh yeah, I did not think he would be straight. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
What was Susan Sontag like? I have to ask.
Oh, what was she like?
Yeah.
Well, you know, she'd been famous so long, and the thing about very famous people is that they can be hateful and lose all their friends, and then they have new friends the next day because all the moths are attracted to the flame. And so she could be warm and charming, and she could be very hostile and difficult. I remember once I invited a charming young couple that I taught with in university. I invited them to dinner with her, and she said in a very loud whisper, "Why did you invite them?" Meaning nobody's. And I said, "They're very rich," which wasn't true. And she said, "Oh." I mean, you know, I think that you had to be exceptional in some way to please her.
Right.
Maybe a lot of people are like that, but you know, they don't just have friends who are casual friends that they watch TV with. That everything has to be a learning. Susan was very full of learning experiences. I mean, she went to all the important movies, and she read all the important books, and she knew everything. I mean, she knew about philosophy. She had studied philosophy. She taught philosophy at the New School. No, she really was brilliant.
Caroline writes, "What would Ripley be doing today? I see him making NFTs or running for Congress in Georgia." Do you see that?
What are NFTs?
Non-fungible tokens. You know that it's really complicated to explain.
Oh, it's like some sort of fake money.
I guess so. Yeah.
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 He would have a great time in our era, I think, because there's so much corruption and so much scheming and so many get-rich-quick ideas and so much corruption in the Trump world, well, in all political worlds, I guess. He would have loved it. It would have given him much more permission to do things than the priggish 1950s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Camilla asks, which elements of the novel make it a popular springboard, or what elements of the novel make it a popular springboard for film adaptations? Conversely, how does the novel elude cinematic reshaping?
I think that it is a successful movie material because the people have very strong motives and they have intentions that are constantly developing in one direction or another. I think what makes a bad novel is something where there's so much, the characters are too ambivalent. They're not clear cut. Like, let's say, Henry James has inspired 2 or 3 good movies, but basically he's not a good source because his characters are constantly second guessing themselves and refining their ideas and rejecting them, and they're not. I mean, a good strong character is Iago, or Captain Ahab. People who are obsessed. Almost all of Balzac's characters are obsessed, and they make good movies. But I think something like Henry James is too rarefied, and the people's thoughts are too qualified to really be movie worthy. But of course, we shouldn't think of movies as the ultimate test. I mean, people tend to think, "Oh, has that book been made into a movie?" Like that's the crowning glory. But I mean, books should have their own integrity and their own dignity, whether they're made into movies or not.
Yeah, I agree with that. This is our last question from someone named Joan. I wonder if it's Joan Shankar, her biographer. Patricia Highsmith loved cats. Do you want to talk about this? Thanks, Joan.
I think that Patricia Highsmith said once, if she saw a starving baby abandoned and saw a starving cat abandoned, she would take care of the cat, not the baby. And I think that's probably quite true. And when she had to have a cat who was very old and ill put to sleep, she wept and wept and wept. And her friend who was with her said she'd never seen so much emotion on Highsmith's part, and that she was depressed for months to come after the cat's death. So I think she, I don't know, people love their animals, and they see them as they are very vulnerable. They can't complain, they can't talk. But a cat is very independent, whereas a dog, the cliche is the dog loves everybody, including the robber. So I don't know. I think that Highsmith, with her fastidiousness and independence, clearly preferred cats to dogs.
That makes sense. Well, that's all the questions we have. Thank you, Ed, so much.
It was fun to do it with you, Thessaly.
It was really fun. Thank you for joining us tonight for Tea Book Club, and thank you especially to Edmund for giving us this new perspective on the book and its author. You can find his essay about the talented Mr. Ripley on our website, tmagazine.com, and if you'd like to continue the conversation, follow us on Twitter at #TMagazine, #TeaBookClub. Finally, we'd like to give a special thank you to all of our subscribers. You make our work possible. We look forward to welcoming you to the next Tea Book Club on June 17th, when Adam Bradley will explore Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man.